They called it the Age of Morality, but behind velvet curtains and gaslit drawing rooms, a darker truth thrived. Imagine walking through the streets of London in 1880, horses clattering, fog swirling, the sound of church bells echoing in the distance. Society paraded itself as pure, devout, and righteous, and yet, inside the homes of the elite, secret arrangements flourished. Among them was a life so hidden, so unspoken, that even scandal sheets hesitated to print it, the life of the male concubine. This was not the East, where harems were whispered of with exotic fascination. This was Victorian England, the empire that ruled half the world, and still, within its heart, lived men whose entire existence depended on secrecy. They were lovers, companions, and confidants to the wealthy, but in public they were shadows. They walked a fine line between privilege and ruin, indulgence and destruction. The tragedy of the male concubine's life begins with the simple fact that he could not exist openly. Every aspect of his identity had to be disguised. In an era when even mentioning sexual impropriety was taboo, a young man living in the home of an aristocratic lady, or worse, a powerful male patron, could never be acknowledged for what he truly was. He was presented as a secretary, a valet, or sometimes just a houseguest. But behind these polite terms lay a hidden arrangement of dependency and control. For the young man himself, it was a world of contradictions. On one hand, he had access to luxuries that ordinary working-class men could never dream of: silk sheets, imported wine, private libraries, and evenings at the theatre. But on the other hand, every sip of that wine, every touch of velvet beneath his fingers, was poisoned by the knowledge that it was not his own. His very survival depended on the whims of his patron. The house he lived in was not his. The clothes he wore were not his. Even his name might be forgotten if scandal forced him into exile. This life of secrecy demanded performance. The male concubine had to be invisible in public, never drawing too much attention, never allowing gossip to rise. He had to learn how to lower his gaze at the right moment, how to stay in the corner at dinners, how to pass through the grand rooms of London townhouses like a servant, even though he was something far more intimate. He could never be introduced as a lover, never even as a companion of equal standing. His role was to disappear whenever guests arrived, yet to remain close enough that his patron could summon him with a glance. And what of love? Could love survive in such secrecy? For some, perhaps, the arrangement carried genuine affection. A wealthy widow who feared loneliness might keep a young man in her home, offering him protection and money in exchange for companionship. A closeted aristocrat might rely on a male concubine as his only source of tenderness, in a world that criminalized his desires. But even when love was real, it was caged. The constant threat of discovery turned passion into paranoia. Every knock at the door, every hushed whisper in the servants' quarters could mean exposure. The tragic irony is that society itself forced these men into invisibility. Victorian England worshipped the idea of the domestic family, the respectable husband, the dutiful wife, the obedient children. Anything that strayed from that model was branded immoral, sinful, even criminal. And so the concubine became a phantom, someone who lived within homes but was never truly acknowledged, someone who dined from the same plates as aristocrats but whose name was erased from family records. For the male concubine, secrecy was not just a burden, it was a prison. He could not speak of his true life even to friends, for fear that one careless word might unravel everything. He could not marry without abandoning his patron, and he could not leave without facing poverty. The outside world had no place for him, because his years of hidden life had given him no respectable profession, no stable reputation. His survival depended entirely on silence, and silence kills. Imagine the psychological toll, waking up each day knowing that your existence is both essential and forbidden. You are desired, yet denied, loved, yet hidden. Every smile you offer in public, every nod of obedience is a mask that protects you from ruin. But behind that mask, the despair grows. You are never free. This, then, is the tragic paradox of the Victorian male concubine. His life was filled with material comfort, but starved of recognition. He was sheltered from poverty, yet constantly threatened by exposure. He was at once the most intimate presence in the household and the most expendable. And when the patron died, or when scandal struck, his life could vanish overnight, like smoke over the Thames, leaving nothing behind but rumour and silence. Victorian England prided itself on progress. Railways, factories, colonies, science. But its hidden histories tell another story. Beneath the polished veneer of morality lay countless untold lives. men who loved in silence, who lived in fear, who were written out of history because their existence challenged society's fragile sense of purity. And among those forgotten lives, none was more tragic than the male concubine, forever present, forever hidden, forever silenced by the cruel necessity of secrecy. They called him fortunate. The neighbours whispered, "He must be lucky, living in such a fine house, dressed in silk, never worrying about money." But what they did not see, the truth that rotted beneath the polished surface, was that he owned nothing. Not the clothes on his back, not the bed he slept in, not even his own freedom. He was a prisoner of luxury, a man whose life depended entirely on the whims of another. This was the tragedy of the male concubine in Victorian England. He was exploited, trapped in a system where affection and wealth were weapons of control. Unlike women mistresses, who at least gained some recognition and financial security, male concubines had no bargaining power. They could not demand titles, inheritance, or even legitimacy. Their entire existence was reduced to one role: serve, obey, and remain invisible. From the very beginning, this life was built upon exploitation. A young man, often from a poor family, often with no prospects, would be noticed by someone wealthy, someone with influence, perhaps an aristocratic widow who craved company but could not remarry without scandal. Perhaps a powerful gentleman whose desires had to remain hidden in a society that criminalized same-sex love. The young man would be offered protection, fine clothes, and a home. At first it seemed like salvation, a chance to escape poverty, to climb above the suffocating grip of the working-class life. But hidden in that bargain was a trap. The patron controlled everything: the food he ate, the company he kept, even the words he spoke in public. The concubine was kept not as a partner, but as a possession. His body, his time, his very future, none of it belonged to him anymore. He was reminded of this constantly. If he disobeyed, if he grew restless, if he dared to speak of independence, the patron could dismiss him in an instant. And with dismissal came ruin. Imagine the fear. One wrong word, one flicker of defiance, and the life of comfort vanished. The silks replaced by rags, the fine house replaced by the cold. Streets of London. There was no contract, no legal bond to protect him. He could not sue for wages. He could not demand inheritance. He could not even publicly admit what role he had served. He was invisible in the eyes of the law, which meant he had no rights. The exploitation was not only material, it was emotional. A patron could demand devotion without offering security. A concubine was expected to play the role of lover, friend, and confidant, to pour his entire heart into someone who might discard him tomorrow. It was love without equality, affection chained to dependence. For the patron, this imbalance was power. For the concubine, it was slow suffocation. And yet society often envied him. Outsiders looked at the fine coats, the theatre boxes, the expensive jewellery, and whispered, "What a fortunate young man." They did not see the reality, that every jewel was a chain, every banquet a reminder that he was bought, not free. They did not see him lower his eyes at dinners, knowing he could never be introduced as anything more than a companion. They did not see him sit silently while his patron's true heirs mocked his presence. One of the cruelest truths of this life was its disposability. A concubine was never meant to last. He was young, desirable, entertaining, and when time stole his youth, he became a burden. Many were cast out without warning, replaced by someone fresher, someone more pleasing. With no property, no savings, and no reputation, they often fell into poverty, brothels, or crime. Their years of service counted for nothing because in the eyes of society, they had never existed at all. Even when affection was genuine, the power imbalance poisoned it. A patron could claim to love his concubine deeply, but that love was not equal. One held all the power, the other none. It was a love built on fear, and fear corrodes the soul. To wake up every morning wondering whether you will still be wanted tomorrow is not love, it is torment disguised as affection. This imbalance also meant exploitation could take darker forms. Some patrons were kind, but others were cruel. Stories survive in whispers of young men locked in rooms for days, punished for minor defiance, of concubines beaten or humiliated, knowing they could not escape without losing everything, of men who were passed between patrons like objects, traded and discarded as if their humanity meant nothing. The law did not protect them, because officially they were not supposed to exist at all. And yet many endured it, because the alternative was worse. Poverty in Victorian England was brutal. Workhouses were notorious for their cruelty. Factories consumed lives, and the streets of London swallowed the desperate. For a poor young man, the choice was between exploitation in silk sheets or starvation in rags. And so he endured, smiling in public, obeying in private, and carrying the heavy burden of knowing that his entire life could collapse at any moment. The male concubine's lack of power was not just personal, it reflected the hypocrisy of Victorian society itself. England prided itself on progress, morality and justice, yet it built an empire on exploitation, of colonies abroad, of workers in factories, and of hidden lives at home. The concubine's plight was one more chapter in this history of control. He was the empire's secret shame, used, silenced, and erased. In the end, the tragedy of exploitation is not simply that it destroyed individual lives. It is that it erased them from history. We know the names of kings and queens, of generals and industrialists, but the young men who lived and died as concubines remain nameless, their stories buried in silence. They left no memoirs, no portraits, no inheritance, only rumours and fragments, whispered in the margins of Victorian scandal. And so when we speak of them today, we speak for the voiceless. We uncover the truth that beneath the silk there was suffering. Beneath the luxury there was dependence. Beneath the illusion of fortune there was only exploitation and the crushing weight of powerlessness. The world saw them as lucky, but history tells us they were trapped. They said love was sacred. They said it was the highest virtue of Christian England. And yet, in Victorian times, love itself could be turned into a crime. To love the wrong person, to love in the wrong way, was enough to destroy your life, your name, and your very freedom. For the male concubine, this was not simply a possibility, it was a daily reality. The moment he entered into that hidden world of intimacy, he stepped into a trap laid by the law. Under the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, any man caught in acts of gross indecency with another man could be sentenced to prison, hard labour, even ruinous public shame. This vague phrase, gross indecency, was broad enough to capture almost anything, a letter, a gesture, even an accusation without proof. The law did not require evidence of violence or coercion. It required only suspicion, and suspicion alone could end a man's life. For a male concubine, this meant that every touch was dangerous, every glance could be fatal. The bedroom was not a place of comfort, but a battlefield where silence and secrecy were the only shields. Even the walls seemed to carry ears, even the servants in the household might whisper, and if word reached the wrong person, a jealous rival, a disapproving relative, or a blackmailer, the entire fragile world collapsed. This constant fear shaped every hour of their existence. Imagine the weight of living a life where you must censor not only your words but your very thoughts. At the dinner table, the concubine must sit quietly, never letting his eyes linger too long on his patron. On the streets, he must walk a careful distance, never allowing intimacy to show. Even in private, there was the fear of discovery, a servant bursting in, a letter falling into the wrong hands, a diary being found. History gives us a chilling example of how devastating such discovery could be. In 1895, Oscar Wilde, the celebrated playwright, was dragged into the courtroom, humiliated before the world, and sentenced to 2 years of hard labour. His only crime, loving another man. His downfall sent a clear message to Victorian society. No matter how famous, how brilliant, or how wealthy you were, the law would crush you if you defied its sexual codes. Now imagine the terror this struck into the hearts of male concubines, who had no fame to protect them, no fortune to cushion the fall. If Oscar Wilde could be destroyed, what chance did they have? This fear was not abstract, it was weaponized. Blackmail became a common threat. Unscrupulous men, servants or acquaintances would demand money in exchange for silence. A single accusation could end a career, ruin a patron, and cast the concubine into prison. Many lived under the constant shadow of extortion, paying what little they had just to keep their secrets safe. The cruelest part of this criminalization was how it twisted love itself into something poisonous. What should have been a source of comfort became a source of dread. Every act of tenderness carried risk. Every whispered word of affection might later serve as evidence in court. Letters, the lifeline of intimacy, became deadly weapons. Many lovers burned their correspondence out of fear, erasing the only proof that they had ever loved at all. For the concubine, this was not just fear of prison, it was fear of annihilation. To be exposed meant losing not only liberty, but also reputation. In Victorian society, reputation was everything. A man who carried the stain of indecency could never find respectable employment, could never marry, could never hold his head up in public again. Families disowned sons, communities exiled neighbours. The punishment did not end with prison walls, it followed the condemned for life. And so, concubines lived in constant performance. They learned to smile at women at parties, to feign interest in courtship, to nod along with sermons about morality. In reality, they carried a private terror that one slip, one careless laugh, one letter left on a desk might bring ruin. This dual life was exhausting, a slow suffocation of the soul. To pretend every day that your love was a crime wore away at the very essence of who you were. The irony of it all was that the concubine's presence was often an open secret. Patrons kept them in their homes, gave them fine clothes, took them to theatres. Society whispered, but rarely confronted. The hypocrisy was staggering. As long as it was never spoken aloud, it could be tolerated. But the moment words were written or evidence emerged, the law would strike. Silence kept you alive. Speech destroyed you. The fear was generational too. Young concubines heard the stories of older men destroyed by scandal, and they learned early to mistrust everyone. To trust a friend was dangerous. To speak openly was fatal. This isolation carved deep scars. Many turned to alcohol, to gambling, to reckless escapes that only worsened their situation. Others simply withered in quiet despair, prisoners not of iron bars, but of invisible fear. The tragedy of the criminalized love is not only in the punishment, but in the erasure it created. How many lives, how many loves were buried without trace? How many stories were silenced? How many relationships destroyed before they could even bloom? The law did not only punish, it erased history itself. The lives of countless male concubines vanished into secrecy, their names unrecorded, their stories untold, their love reduced to shadows. And yet, beneath all this fear, love still persisted. Hidden, fragile, trembling, but alive. Even in the darkest corners of Victorian prisons, men wrote poems to each other, carved initials into walls, whispered words of defiance. The human heart, after all, cannot be fully criminalized, and it is in those small, secret acts of love that we glimpse their courage. But courage did not erase the tragedy. For the male concubine, love was both salvation and curse. It gave him meaning, yet it could destroy him. It gave him warmth, yet it filled him with terror. He lived each day in the paradox of being loved and condemned, desired and criminalized. This was the essence of his life, not just secrecy, not just exploitation, but constant fear. Fear that never lifted, fear that shadowed every embrace. And in that fear lies the cruelest truth of Victorian England, that it was not enough to silence love. The empire made love itself into a crime, and in doing so, condemned generations of men to live and die in the shadows. They were surrounded by people, and yet utterly alone. In a crowded Victorian townhouse where servants bustled, guests laughed over wine, and aristocrats danced in candlelit halls, the male concubine stood like a ghost, present but never belonging, visible but never recognized. For him, isolation was not the silence of empty rooms. It was the crushing loneliness of living in a world where his very existence had to be denied. From the moment he entered into such a life, the concubine was cut off. His family often disappeared from his story, either out of shame or because he was forbidden from contact. His friendships were shallow, since no confidant could be trusted with the truth. He could not speak of his role, could not speak of his love, could not even speak of his fears. His life was a performance staged for society, but behind the curtain there was no one to hear his true voice. This isolation was more brutal than any physical confinement. Prison cells have walls, but secrecy builds thicker ones. A concubine might live in a grand house, sleep in a velvet bed, eat from fine china, and yet be lonelier than a beggar on the street. The beggar, at least, could speak his name, confess his hunger, tell his story. The concubine had to erase his story to survive. The psychology of such a life was suffocating. He lived each day knowing he was needed, yet never acknowledged. He was the keeper of secrets, the silent witness to his patron's private life, the listener of whispered confessions, but he had no one to share his own with. Every word he longed to say had to be swallowed, every fear had to be hidden behind a calm smile. He became an expert in silence, and silence slowly consumed him. At social gatherings, this loneliness sharpened like a blade. He would stand in the corner while others toasted, laughed, and formed bonds. He could never join in fully, for his position was undefined, too intimate to be a servant, too lowly to be a guest. He belonged nowhere. Conversation swirled around him, but he was excluded, a figure both present and absent. This was the cruel paradox of his existence, always there, never included. Even in his relationship with his patron, isolation remained. Yes, they shared private moments, perhaps even genuine affection, but the relationship was unbalanced. The patron could speak of his public life, his wealth, his worries. The concubine could never speak of his own heart, without fear of overstepping, of appearing ungrateful, of risking dismissal. Love without equality is not companionship, it is another form of loneliness. The longer he lived this way, the more the isolation grew. Years of silence hardened into despair. The concubine often began to feel invisible, as though he did not truly exist outside the shadows of his pat. Ron's home. Without recognition, without acknowledgement, the human soul begins to wither. He was loved privately but erased publicly, cherished in secret but despised if exposed. What does it do to a man to live his entire life as if he were a shameful secret? History rarely records the psychological torment of such men, yet we can imagine it, the sleepless nights, staring at ceilings gilded with wealth but heavy with silence, the gnawing fear of aging, knowing that with every wrinkle, every grey hair, he slipped closer to replacement, the quiet jealousy of seeing his patron mingle freely in society, while he could only watch from behind, the desperate need for companionship, met with nothing but locked lips and empty rooms. Isolation also robbed him of identity. He could not claim his relationship. He could not be honest about his role. Even his name might be altered in letters, erased in records, or concealed from servants. In a world obsessed with reputation, his had to be fabricated. Who was he? A secretary? A valet? A distant cousin? The answer was always a lie, and when a man must lie about who he is every day, he begins to lose track of himself. The concubine's loneliness was made worse by the constant need to mask emotions. He could not express anger when slighted, could not reveal despair when abandoned, could not show joy too openly in case it drew suspicion. His entire emotional world had to be hidden, bottled up inside, unshared, unacknowledged. This emotional suppression was a slow torture, an invisible cage that trapped not only his body, but his mind. Some coped through small rebellions, secret diaries written in coded words, poems hidden in drawers, tiny acts of defiance against silence. Others turned to destructive outlets, alcohol, gambling, reckless liaisons that only deepened their vulnerability. Many simply endured, withdrawing further into themselves, until they became hollow figures, alive but not truly living. The cruelest aspect of this isolation was its permanence. Unlike a prisoner who knows the length of his sentence, the concubine never knew when or if it would end. Dismissal meant disgrace, while remaining meant invisibility. Either way, freedom was a distant dream. His isolation was not temporary, it was the defining feature of his life. Victorian society itself ensured this. A world obsessed with morality and reputation could not allow him to be seen, to be recognised, to be given dignity. He was condemned to walk through life as a shadow, close enough to touch power, yet never granted it. Close enough to taste love, yet never allowed to claim it. And so the concubine's tragedy lies not only in secrecy, not only in exploitation, but in this crushing psychological isolation. He was silenced by law, abandoned by society, and trapped in a relationship that could never be equal. His body might have been kept in luxury, but his soul was locked in a dungeon of loneliness. In the end, perhaps the deepest cruelty of Victorian England was not that it punished love. It was that it forced love into silence, leaving men to live their entire lives in loneliness that no one dared to name. The male concubine's isolation was not the absence of people, but the absence of recognition, of honesty, of freedom. And in that silence, countless lives faded into shadows, erased not by death alone, but by loneliness itself. It could all end with a single whisper, not a trial, not a newspaper headline, just one careless word overheard in the wrong drawing room. For the male concubine of Victorian England, scandal was not a distant fear. It was a shadow that followed him everywhere, waiting for the smallest crack in silence to tear his life apart. Victorian society lived on appearances. Respectability was its highest currency, more valuable than gold, more fragile than glass. To appear moral, pitas, pure and family-centred was everything. And yet behind the polished facades of London townhouses, secrets festered, affairs, hidden desires, forbidden loves. For the aristocrat, these secrets could sometimes be smoothed over with wealth or influence, but for the male concubine, discovery meant annihilation. The danger began with the very structure of his life. He was always close to his patron, too close for comfort. A young man living in the home of a wealthy widow or bachelor attracted whispers from neighbours, servants, even visiting relatives. Why was he always there? Why did he accompany the patron on trips? Why did he receive gifts beyond his station? In a world obsessed with gossip, every detail was fodder for suspicion, and suspicion alone was enough to ignite scandal. Scandal in Victorian England was merciless. Newspapers thrived on it, printing salacious stories about aristocrats and their private lives. Even if names were disguised, society always guessed. Once rumour spread, reputations crumbled overnight. A patron might lose his social standing, his political influence, even his fortune. And the concubine, he became the convenient scapegoat, blamed for seduction, corruption, immorality. If the patron escaped with a tarnished reputation, the concubine rarely escaped at all. The ruin could take many forms. Sometimes it was legal, prison under the Labouchere Amendment, hard labour in disgraceful conditions, the permanent stain of a criminal record. Other times it was social, banishment from elite circles, disownment by family, loss of livelihood. But most often it was both. The concubine lived in a fragile house of cards, where one gust of gossip could send everything crashing down. The cruelty lay in how little it took to spark such ruin: a discarded letter, a servant's testimony, a jealous rival's accusation. Even innocent gestures could be twisted into evidence. In the infamous trials of Oscar Wilde, mere letters filled with affection were paraded before the court as proof of gross indecency. If this could happen to a celebrated playwright, what chance did an unknown concubine have? And unlike Wilde, the concubine had no admirers to defend him, no wealth to fight back, no fame to cushion the fall. When scandal struck, he was utterly defenceless. His name, already fragile, became mud. He could not return home, for family honour was paramount in Victorian England. He could not find respectable work, for employers feared association with disgrace. He could not marry, for who would wed a man marked by scandal? Often, his only options were exile, prostitution, or starvation. Fear of scandal governed his every move. He lived a life of constant vigilance, never speaking too openly, never laughing too loudly, never showing affection in public. He measured his words, his expressions, even his silences. The concubine became an actor in a performance he could never step away from. Every day was a balancing act between appearing invisible and remaining indispensable. This fear also poisoned relationships within the household. Servants, always watchful, could not be trusted. Any one of them might sell secrets for money or revenge. Guests too might notice oddities. A young man seated too close, a glance exchanged too long, and carry tales outside. Even friends posed danger, for in an era of blackmail, betrayal was always one payment away. The tragedy of this existence was not only the fear of exposure, but the knowledge of how little society valued him. When scandal erupted, the patron might recover, albeit wounded. The concubine, however, was disposable. He was blamed, discarded, and forgotten. His years of devotion counted for nothing. He was not remembered as a lover or companion, but as a corrupter, a shameful figure erased from respectable memory. And yet, despite the ever-present risk, many concubines endured because the alternative was worse. To return to poverty, to the brutal labour of factories or the cruelty of workhouses, seemed unbearable. Better to live in constant fear than to starve in certainty. But that choice came with a terrible cost. A lifetime lived on the edge of ruin. Some did not survive it. Broken by scandal, humiliated beyond repair, there were concubines who vanished into the abyss of history, dying nameless in slums, emigrating to distant lands under false identities, or taking their own lives to escape the shame. Their stories were never recorded because Victorian society preferred silence. Better to erase their existence than confront the hypocrisy that created it. The risk of scandal was, in truth, the weapon society wielded to keep them silent. It was not just about punishment, it was about control. By making the threat of ruin so complete, society ensured that concubines would remain shadows, never daring to claim dignity, never daring to live openly. Fear itself became the cage, and scandal the executioner. And so, the male concubine's life was a constant gamble. Every smile, every touch, every word could either sustain his hidden world or destroy it. He lived in luxury, but walked on a knife's edge. He shared intimacy, but never security. He was cherished in secret, but condemned the moment the secret slipped. In the end, his tragedy lies in the fragility of it all. A lifetime of silence, of service, of devotion, erased by one rumour. A name, once whispered in private with love, transformed into public disgrace. The risk of scandal was not a distant possibility. It was the inevitable shadow that stalked every concubine every day until the very end. This was the cruel final truth of Victorian England, that the great danger for these men was not poverty, not loneliness, not even the law itself. It was the ever-present risk that the world would see them as they truly were,